Hello, everyone. Tonight, our stories are about the masks that people wear, the carefully constructed facades of normalcy that can conceal a darkness so profound it defies comprehension. We will begin with the story of a man who was, by all accounts, the perfect American son. He was handsome, intelligent, and charismatic. He was a brilliant law student, a rising star in local politics, and a compassionate volunteer at a crisis suicide hotline. A man who literally talked people back from the brink of despair. He was the kind of man a young woman could trust, the kind of man you would be happy to have as a neighbor. But behind this flawless, all-American mask was a different person entirely. A predator of unparalleled cruelty and cunning. A hunter who stalked the campuses and suburbs of the Pacific Northwest. And one of the most prolific and monstrous serial killers in the nation's history. His name was Ted Bundy. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to consider the nature of trust. Think about the people in your life you trust implicitly, the faces you associate with safety and kindness. Now, imagine one of those faces being a mask, a perfect disguise for a reality so violent and so evil it would shatter your understanding of the world. It's a comfort to know we can explore these dark chapters together. A quiet community gathering from all corners of the globe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's pull back the curtain on the handsome stranger and the terrifying truth that lay hidden behind his perfect smile. Ted Bundy. The handsome serial killer of the Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s was a place of profound social change and burgeoning freedom. It was an era of hitchhiking, of newfound independence for young women, and of a general optimistic trust in the goodness of strangers. College campuses across Washington and Oregon were vibrant hubs of intellectual and social energy, filled with bright, ambitious young women who were, for the first time, carving out their own paths, free from the constraints of their parents' generation. But in the spring of 1974, a shadow began to fall over this idyllic landscape. A quiet, insidious fear began to creep across the campuses and into the suburbs. Young women, bright, capable students with promising futures, started to disappear. The disappearances were baffling in their similarity and their brazenness. The victims were all young, attractive women with long, dark hair, usually parted in the middle, and they were vanishing in broad daylight, from busy, public places where they should have been perfectly safe. The first to be officially linked in this terrifying pattern was Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old psychology student at the University of Washington. On the morning of February 1st, 1974, she vanished from her basement bedroom in a crowded university district house. Her roommates found her bed neatly made, but the pillowcase was missing, and a small spot of blood was found on her nightgown. It was as if she had been plucked from her own bed while the rest of the house slept. Over the next few months, the pattern escalated. In March, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson, a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, disappeared while walking to a jazz concert on campus. In April, Susan Elaine Rancourt, a student at Central Washington University, vanished after a late-night meeting. In May, 2 more young women disappeared. The police were dealing with a ghost. There were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, and no bodies. The only connection was the victims themselves. All bright, young coeds, all with long, dark hair. A sense of panic began to grip the region. Law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions formed a task force, but they had nothing to go on. They were hunting a phantom. The most terrifying and audacious chapter in this early spree occurred on a single sunny summer afternoon. On July 14, 1974, thousands of people had gathered at Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreation area east of Seattle, to enjoy the warm weather. In the midst of this bustling, happy crowd, the phantom went to work. A 23-year-old parole officer named Janice Annott vanished from the park in the middle of the afternoon. A few hours later, just a short distance away on the same crowded beach, a 19-year-old nursing student named Denise Marie Naslund also disappeared. 2 women had vanished from the same park, on the same day, surrounded by thousands of potential witnesses. It was from the chaos of the Lake Sammamish disappearances that the first crucial clues began to emerge. Several young women came forward to the police with a strange and unsettling story. They all described being approached that day by a handsome, charismatic young man. He was well-dressed, polite, and articulate. His arm was in a sling, and he introduced himself as Ted. He would ask them for help, claiming he was having trouble loading his sailboat onto his car, a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. He was so charming, so non-threatening, that several of the women admitted they had been tempted to help him, following him towards his car before getting a sudden, intuitive feeling of unease and backing away. The police now had a name, Ted, a description of a handsome, well-spoken man, a method of luring victims, and a specific type of car. They had the first hazy outlines of their phantom. A composite sketch was drawn up and distributed across the state. While the police were chasing this ghost, the man himself was living a life of almost impossible normalcy. His name was Theodore Robert Bundy. He was, to all who knew him, the very picture of a promising young man. He was a recent honors graduate in psychology from the University of Washington. He was handsome and articulate, with a smile that could disarm anyone. He was active in state politics, working for the re-election campaign of Washington's Republican governor, a rising star in the local party. And, in the ultimate chilling irony, he was a volunteer at a Seattle suicide crisis hotline, the man on the other end of the line, talking desperate people through their darkest moments. He was in a long-term, serious relationship with a woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother whom he had been dating for years. He was a loving, paternal figure to her young daughter. They lived a quiet, domestic life. He was, by all accounts, the perfect boyfriend, the perfect citizen, the boy next door. But Elizabeth, like so many who were close to Bundy, saw fleeting, terrifying glimpses of the darkness that lay beneath the perfect mask. He had a strange, brooding side, a volatile temper, and a collection of odd items in his apartment, including plaster of Paris, the material used to make a cast for a fake injury, and a pair of crutches despite having no apparent need for them. As the news of the disappearances spread and the composite sketch of Ted was published in the papers, a cold dread began to form in Elizabeth Klopfer's mind. The sketch bore a startling resemblance to her boyfriend. The car described by the witnesses, a light-colored VW Beetle, was the same car he drove. The name, Ted, was his own. Overcome with a suspicion that was too terrible to ignore, she made a phone call. She contacted the Seattle Police Department and told them about her boyfriend, about the car, about the crutches, about her fears. She was not the only one. And Rule, a former police officer and true crime writer who had worked alongside Bundy at the crisis hotline, also saw the sketch and recognized her charming, intelligent coworker. She too contacted the police. But law enforcement, inundated with thousands of tips, initially dismissed the leads. The man they were being told about, the bright, promising, politically connected law student, simply did not fit their profile of a violent, deviant killer. Ted Bundy was too normal, too respectable. He was hidden in plain sight, protected by the very mask of normalcy that he had so masterfully constructed. In the autumn of 1974, Ted Bundy left Washington. He had been accepted into law school at the University of Utah, a new chapter in his promising career. And just as he left, the string of disappearances that had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for nearly a year abruptly stopped. The phantom, it seemed, was gone, but the relief was short-lived. A few weeks later, in the suburbs of Salt Lake City, a new wave of disappearances began, a series of crimes that mirrored the Washington cases with terrifying precision. A 17-year-old girl named Melissa Smith, the daughter of a local police chief, vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. A few weeks later, a 17-year-old named Laura M. disappeared after a high school party. The pattern was the same. Young, vibrant women, vanishing without a trace. The handsome stranger had simply moved his hunting ground, taking his deadly, insatiable appetite with him to a new state, leaving the police in Washington to grapple with a mystery whose source had already packed up and gone. In 1974, as Ted Bundy settled into his new life as a law student at the University of Utah, the geography of fear shifted with him. The Pacific Northwest breathed a collective, tentative sigh of relief as the disappearances that had haunted them ceased. But in the mountain states of Utah and Colorado, a new and horrifyingly familiar pattern began to emerge. The Phantom had found a new hunting ground. The victims in this new chapter were eerily similar to those he had left behind. In October, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, the daughter of a police chief in a Salt Lake City suburb, vanished. Her body was found in the mountains 9 days later. In November, 17-year-old Laura M. disappeared after leaving a Halloween party. Her body was discovered by hikers on Thanksgiving Day. The terror then spread to Colorado. In January of 1975, a 23-year-old nurse named Karen Campbell disappeared from the hallway of a hotel in Snowmass, a popular ski resort. She had left her fiancé in the hotel lobby to go back to their room to retrieve a magazine and was never seen again. Her body was found a month later, buried in a snowbank. The police in Utah and Colorado were now grappling with the same kind of mystery that had stumped their colleagues in Washington. They were hunting a ghost, a predator who moved with a terrifying, almost supernatural, ability to strike and disappear without a trace. They had no witnesses, no suspects, and a growing list of missing and murdered young women. But on November 8, 1974, the killer made his first critical mistake. He left behind a survivor. The young woman who would change everything was an 18-year-old named Carol Durant. She was at the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, a suburb of Salt Lake City, when she was approached by a handsome, well-spoken man. He introduced himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told her, with an air of calm authority, that someone had been seen trying to break into her car in the parking lot, and that he needed her to accompany him to the vehicle to file a report. Carol, though initially hesitant, was convinced by his professional demeanor and the police badge he briefly flashed. She agreed to go with him. He led her through the parking lot to his car, a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. As they approached, she noticed there was no police radio, no official markings. A flicker of unease went through her. The man told her it would be easier to go directly to the police station. She got into the passenger seat. As they began to drive away from the mall, the man's demeanor shifted. He suddenly pulled over to the side of the road, and in a terrifyingly swift motion, he snapped a handcuff onto one of her wrists. Panic surged through Carol Durant. She knew with absolute certainty that this was not a police officer. This was an abduction. As he reached for the second handcuff, she began to fight for her life. She screamed, she kicked, she clawed at him. The man, surprised by her fierce resistance, tried to subdue her with a crowbar. "I'll kill you," he threatened. But Carol fought with the pure, adrenaline-fueled terror of a person facing their own death. She managed to get her door open and tumbled out of the car, running back towards the highway, the single handcuff still dangling from her wrist. A passing motorist saw the terrified young woman and stopped to help her, and her attacker sped away into the night. Carol Durant had escaped, and she had seen her attacker's face. Just a few hours later, on the campus of a nearby high school, the same man attempted to abduct another young woman, 17-year-old Deborah Kent, using a similar ruse. This time, he was successful. Deborah Kent was never seen alive again. But the killer had now left behind something more dangerous than any physical clue. A living, breathing witness who could identify him. For nearly a year, the investigations in Washington, Utah, and Colorado proceeded on separate tracks. A series of baffling, parallel mysteries. The handsome stranger remained a phantom. Then, in the early morning hours of August 16, 1975, the phantom's luck finally ran out. A highway patrolman in a suburb of Salt Lake City spotted a tan VW Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood, its headlights off. The officer, thinking it was a potential burglar, pulled the car over. The driver was calm, handsome, and articulate. His name was Ted Bundy. When the officer began to question him, Bundy's calm facade cracked, and he tried to flee. He was quickly apprehended. A search of his Volkswagen revealed something far more sinister than stolen goods. It was a predator's toolkit. Inside the car, police found a crowbar, an ice pick, a pair of handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and strips of torn cloth. It was the discovery of this killer's kit that finally connected the respectable law student to the string of violent crimes. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place with chilling speed. The authorities in Utah now had a prime suspect. They brought Carol Duranch in to view a police lineup. Without a moment's hesitation, she pointed directly at Ted Bundy. "That's him," she said, her voice shaking but certain. They had their man. The news of Bundy's arrest in Utah sent shockwaves through the law enforcement communities in Washington and Colorado. The name Ted Bundy, which had been just one of thousands of low-priority tips in the Washington disappearances, was suddenly at the top of the list. The police in Seattle revisited the phone calls they had received nearly a year earlier from Elizabeth Klopfer and Enrule. The details they had provided, the VW Beetle, the crutches, the plaster, the name Ted, now fit together with terrifying precision. They began to cross-reference Bundy's credit card receipts with the dates and locations of the disappearances. They found a trail of gasoline purchases that placed him in the immediate vicinity of nearly every single crime, from Washington to Utah to Colorado. The different police departments, which had been working in isolation, began to share their files. A single, horrifying picture began to emerge. The phantom that had haunted 3 states was a single individual, and that individual was the handsome, charming law student, Ted Bundy. In February of 1976, Ted Bundy went on trial not for murder, but for the aggravated kidnapping of Carol Duranch. He was confident, even arrogant, in the courtroom. He waived his right to a jury trial, believing he could charm and outwit a single judge. He acted as his own co-counsel, cross-examining Carol Duranch himself, trying to pick apart her story. But her testimony was unshakable. Her account of the terror she experienced was powerful and credible. The evidence of the handcuffs, combined with her positive identification, was overwhelming. The judge found him guilty. Ted Bundy, the man who had been a rising star in politics and law, was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. The mask of normalcy had been shattered. He was now a convicted felon, but the charge was just kidnapping. The authorities in Colorado were now preparing to extradite him to stand trial for a much more serious crime, the murder of Karen Campbell. The legal battle was far from over, and Ted Bundy, trapped in a cage for the first time in his life, was already plotting his next move, an escape that would unleash him back onto an unsuspecting world for one final, bloody rampage. The conviction for kidnapping in Utah was just the opening act in the legal saga of Ted Bundy. The authorities in Aspen, Colorado now had their man, and they immediately began the process of extraditing him to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell. The evidence against him in the Campbell case was strong. Witnesses from the Snowmass Hotel where she had disappeared had identified Bundy as being in the hotel lobby that night. More importantly, investigators had found physical evidence linking him directly to the crime. A search of his VW Beetle had turned up hairs that were microscopically consistent with Karen Campbell's, and credit card receipts once again placed him in the area at the exact time of her disappearance. For the first time, Bundy was facing a murder charge, a charge that carried the possibility of the death penalty. In the spring of 1977, Bundy was transferred to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado. The change in venue marked a change in his legal strategy and his demeanor. Faced with a capital murder charge, his arrogance began to mix with a desperate, cunning desire for freedom. He continued to insist on acting as his own co-counsel, a decision that granted him certain privileges, including access to the courthouse's law library and the right to move about the building without being shackled. The courthouse in Aspen was a quaint, old-fashioned building, a place with a relaxed, small-town atmosphere that was ill-prepared for a prisoner of Bundy's intelligence and manipulative skill. He saw its weaknesses and he began to plot. On June 7, 1977, during a pretrial hearing, Bundy saw his chance. He had requested to use the courthouse law library to research his case. The library was on the 2nd floor. As the guards and his own court-appointed attorney were distracted, Bundy, who had been secretly exercising and slimming down in his cell, walked quietly to an open window. In a single, fluid motion, he leaped out. He landed with a thud on the ground below, injuring his ankle. but he scrambled to his feet and disappeared into the surrounding town. The escape of one of the nation's most notorious accused murderers sparked a massive manhunt. The small town of Aspen was thrown into chaos. Roadblocks were set up, and police fanned out across the rugged mountain terrain. Bundy, however, was not a master outdoorsman. He broke into a vacant cabin high in the mountains, stealing food and supplies, but he was ill-equipped for the harsh conditions. He was cold, hungry, and his injured ankle was making travel difficult. After 6 days on the run, he was spotted driving a stolen car back in Aspen. He was pulled over and, this time, he surrendered without a fight. His first taste of freedom had been a miserable failure, but it had taught him a valuable lesson. A simple, impulsive leap was not enough. His next escape would have to be a masterpiece of patience and meticulous planning. After his recapture, Bundy was moved to a more secure facility in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He was now seen as a serious flight risk, and his privileges were curtailed. But Bundy was a master of psychological manipulation, and he began to play the part of the model prisoner. He was cooperative, quiet, and seemingly resigned to his fate. He slowly lulled the guards into a state of complacency, and all the while he was planning. His cell had a ceiling made of soft steel and plaster. Over a period of several months, using a hacksaw blade he had either smuggled in or acquired from another inmate, Bundy began the slow, painstaking process of cutting a hole in his ceiling. He worked at night, his efforts masked by the sounds of the prison. During the day, he would cover the hole with a stack of books and papers, concealing his work from the guards. He had also acquired a map of the jail and civilian clothes. He had been starving himself, losing over 30 pounds, so that he could fit through the narrow crawl space above his cell. On the night of December 30th, 1977, with most of the guards off for the Christmas holiday and a skeleton crew on duty, Bundy put his plan into action. He squeezed through the 1-foot square hole he had cut in his ceiling and entered the crawl space above. He navigated through the dark, dusty maze of pipes and wires until he found an opening that led into the apartment of the chief jailer, who, conveniently, was out for the evening with his wife. Bundy dropped down into the apartment, changed into the civilian clothes he had hidden, and simply walked out the front door. He had escaped from a secure jail, and this time he had a significant head start. No one would even realize he was gone until the next morning's roll call. Nearly 17 hours later, Ted Bundy was now a free man, a ghost loose upon the country. He immediately stole a car and drove east, away from the intense police presence in Colorado. He made his way across the country, eventually ending up in Tallahassee, Florida, a place where no one knew his face, a place where he could reinvent himself. He rented a small apartment near the campus of Florida State University, using the alias Chris Hagen. He was once again living in the midst of a vibrant community of young, trusting college students, the very environment that had always been his preferred hunting ground. The mask of the charming, intelligent law student was gone. The Ted Bundy who arrived in Florida was a different creature entirely. He was a desperate fugitive, his rage and his compulsions now completely untethered. The thin veneer of normalcy that he had maintained for so long had been stripped away by his conviction and his 2 escapes. The monster was now fully unleashed. For 2 terrifying weeks in January of 1978, he lived anonymously near the FSU campus. And then, in the early morning hours of January 15th, he walked to the Chi Omega sorority house, a place filled with dozens of sleeping young women, and unleashed a torrent of violence so savage and so frenzied that it would shock a nation and seal his own fate forever. The final, bloody chapter of his reign of terror had begun. The Ted Bundy who arrived in Tallahassee in January 1978 was a predator unbound. His carefully constructed facade had been shattered, and all that remained was the raw, violent core of his personality. In the early morning hours of Sunday, January 15th, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through a faulty back door. He moved silently through the dark, quiet hallways, armed with a heavy piece of oak firewood he had picked up outside. He then proceeded to go from room to room, unleashing a blitz attack of unimaginable savagery. He bludgeoned 4 young women in their beds as they slept, Two of them, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, were killed. The other two were left with life-altering injuries. The attacks were frenzied and brutal, a level of violence that even Bundy had not displayed before. One of the victims had been so viciously bitten that the imprint of Bundy's teeth was left on her flesh, a piece of forensic evidence that would prove to be his undoing. After leaving a scene of carnage at the sorority house, he walked just a few blocks away, broke into another apartment, and attacked another student, leaving her with a fractured skull. He had attacked 5 women in the space of less than an hour. The city of Tallahassee awoke to a scene of horror and a massive police investigation. But Bundy was already a ghost. He fled the city and drifted across the Florida Panhandle. His final act of violence occurred on February 9, 1978, in Lake City, Florida. He abducted a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach, the youngest of all his known victims, from her middle school. Her body was found weeks later in a state park. Bundy's luck, however, was finally running out. On February 15th, just a few days after Kimberly Leach's murder, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, spotted a familiar orange VW Beetle driving suspiciously in the early morning hours. It was a stolen vehicle. The officer pulled the car over. The driver was Ted Bundy. After a brief but violent struggle, he was apprehended for the last time. The handsome stranger's reign of terror was definitively over. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders was a media spectacle of unprecedented proportions, one of the first major trials to be televised nationally. Bundy, ever the narcissist, relished the spotlight. He was flamboyant, arrogant, and utterly delusional, firing his defense team and choosing to represent himself once again. He played to the cameras, believing he could charm the jury and the American public, just as he had charmed his victims. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Eyewitnesses placed him near the sorority house, and most damningly, the bite mark left on Lisa Levy's body was a perfect, forensic match to his own crooked teeth. It was a piece of physical evidence as unique and as irrefutable as a fingerprint. In July of 1979, the jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of burglary. As the verdict was read, Bundy, for the first time, seemed to lose his composure, his mask of confident charm finally cracking. The judge, Edward Cowart, in a now-famous sentencing statement, addressed Bundy directly. "It is ordered that you be put to death by a current of electricity," he said before adding, "Take care of yourself, young man. It's a tragedy to this court to see such a total waste of humanity." Bundy was sent to Florida State Prison's death row. While there, he would be tried and convicted again for the murder of Kimberly Leach, receiving a 3rd death sentence. For years, he continued to play games with the legal system, filing endless appeals and maintaining his innocence. But as his execution date drew near, his strategy shifted. In a final, desperate bid to delay his fate, he began to confess. In a series of interviews with investigators and journalists, he finally began to reveal the true, horrifying scope of his crimes. He confessed to dozens of murders, providing details that only the killer could have known and helping to close cold cases that had haunted families for years. He admitted to murders in Washington, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. He described his methods, his motivations, and the dark psychological landscape of his mind. He claimed the total number of his victims was over 30, but investigators believe the true number could be much higher. He had been a phantom in so many places, for so long, that the full extent of his evil will likely never be known. His confession was a chilling, self-aggrandizing performance, the final act of a man who needed to be the star of his own story, even if that story was one of monstrous evil. He blamed his actions on an addiction to violent pornography and a mysterious, dark entity within him, never fully taking personal responsibility for the lives he had destroyed. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison walls, a crowd of hundreds had gathered, cheering and setting off fireworks as the switch was thrown. It was a cathartic, almost celebratory, end to one of the darkest chapters in American crime. The legacy of Ted Bundy is a complex and terrifying one. He shattered the myth of what a serial killer was supposed to look like. He was not a disheveled, socially inept outcast. He was handsome, intelligent, educated, and charming. He was the man who could have been your neighbor, your coworker, your friend, and it was this perfect mask of normalcy that was his greatest weapon. He exploited the trust and kindness of strangers, turning their best instincts against them. His case had a profound impact on law enforcement, helping to advance the science of criminal profiling and our understanding of the psychology of serial offenders. He became the archetypal handsome stranger, a permanent fixture in our popular culture, a symbol of the terrifying idea that true evil can wear the most ordinary and attractive of faces. He was a man who possessed all the outward attributes of a successful life, but was, on the inside, a hollowed-out creature of pure predatory narcissism, a man who left behind a trail of shattered lives and a permanent scar on the American psyche. The vanishing of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers in the vast, churning expanse of the North Atlantic, some 20 miles west of the rugged outer coast of Scotland, lies a small, lonely cluster of islands known as the Flannan Isles. For centuries, these windswept, uninhabited rocks were places of superstition and dread for the mariners who navigated these treacherous waters. They were known as the Seven Hunters, a place of ghosts and strange, otherworldly phenomena. Sailors would speak of them in hushed tones, believing it was bad luck to linger too long in their shadow. It was a place defined by its profound and almost absolute isolation, a fortress of granite lashed by some of the most violent seas on Earth. And it was here, on the highest point of the largest island, Eilean Mor, that a monument to human resilience was built. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse, completed in 1899, the lighthouse was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a 75-foot tower of brilliant white brick designed to cast a life-saving beam of light across one of the most dangerous shipping lanes in the world. To man this remote outpost, the Northern Lighthouse Board required men of a very particular character. They had to be disciplined, self-reliant, and psychologically robust, men capable of enduring long stretches of intense solitude. Their only companions the roar of the wind, the crash of the surf, and the two other men who shared their watch. The work was a rigid, monotonous routine of cleaning lenses, polishing brass, winding the clockwork mechanism that turned the light, and meticulously recording every detail of their work and the weather in a daily log. It was a life of profound isolation, but also of profound responsibility. The lives of countless sailors depended on their unwavering vigilance. In the winter of 1900, just a year after the light was first lit, the three men assigned to the Eilean Mor station were Thomas Marshall, the second assistant keeper, James Duckett, the principal keeper, and Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper. They were all experienced, seasoned men of the sea. Duckett, at 43, was a veteran with over 2 decades of service. Marshall, 28, was a solid and dependable keeper. And MacArthur, 40, was a tough, experienced seaman filling in for another keeper on sick leave. These were not novices. They were professionals, men who understood the dangers and demands of their work intimately. Their tour of duty was meant to end just before Christmas. On December 15th, the lighthouse relief vessel, the Hesperus, was scheduled to make its routine journey from the Scottish mainland to bring supplies, mail, and the relief keeper who would take over for one of the men for their shore leave. The Hesperus, however, was delayed. A powerful winter storm, a common and brutal occurrence in the North Atlantic, swept through the region, churning the seas into a violent, impassable chaos. For several days, no ship could safely make the crossing. It wasn't until Boxing Day, December 26, 1900, that the storm had subsided enough for the Hesperus to finally set sail. The ship, under the command of Captain James Harvey, battled its way through the heavy, rolling seas. On board was the relief keeper, a man named Joseph Moore. As they approached the Flannan Isles, a sense of profound unease began to settle over the crew. Eilean Mor was usually a welcome sight, its powerful light a beacon of safety. But as the island came into view, the lighthouse was dark. This was deeply troubling. The light should have been lit, even during the day in such overcast weather. As they drew closer, the scene became even more unsettling. The island was eerily silent. There was no flag flying from the flagpole, a standard signal that the keepers were aware of the relief ship's arrival. The landing platforms, one on the east and one on the west side of the island to accommodate different sea conditions, were empty. There were no provision boxes left out on the landing, ready to be restocked. There was no one waiting to greet them, no sign of life at all. Captain Harvey began sounding the ship's horn and fired a signal flare, the loud blasts echoing off the stone cliffs. But the only response was the cry of the gulls and the roar of the surf. The island remained stubbornly, unervingly silent. A knot of fear and dread began to form in the pit of Joseph Moore's stomach. He knew the three men on the island. He knew their discipline, their adherence to the rigid protocols of the Northern Lighthouse Board. For the station to be in this state, something had to be terribly, catastrophically wrong. The sea was still too rough to attempt a landing at the main east side platform. Captain Harvey carefully maneuvered the Hesperus to the more sheltered west landing. Joseph Moore, his heart pounding, was lowered into a small dinghy. As he was rowed towards the rocky shore, he scanned the cliffs for any sign of his colleagues. He saw nothing. He leaped from the dinghy onto the landing platform and began the long, steep climb up the stone staircase that was carved into the cliff face, leading to the lighthouse tower nearly 200 feet above. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own heavy breathing and the relentless crash of the waves below. He reached the top of the cliff and walked towards the lighthouse compound, a small settlement of stone buildings enclosed by a wall. He found the main gate to the compound closed. The door to the lighthouse tower itself was also closed, but, strangely, it was unlocked. Moore pushed the door open and stepped inside. The entrance hall was cold and still. A strange, palpable sense of abandonment hung in the air. He called out the names of his colleagues. Thomas? James? Donald? His voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no reply. He proceeded into the main living quarters. What he found there only deepened the mystery. The keeper's living room was in a state of quiet, arrested domesticity. A meal, consisting of meat and potatoes, lay uneaten on the kitchen table. An overturned chair lay on the floor, as if someone had pushed back from the table in a sudden hurry. The clock on the wall had stopped. In the keeper's bedrooms, the beds were made, the rooms tidy. In the entrance hall, a single set of oilskins, the heavy, waterproof gear worn by the keepers, was hanging on its peg. 2 sets were missing. This last detail was particularly baffling. It suggested that 2 of the keepers had gone out into the storm, but one had, for some inexplicable reason, remained behind. But where was he? And why would 2 experienced keepers venture out into what must have been a ferocious storm without the third? Lighthouse protocol strictly forbade such a thing. 1 man was required to be on watch in the tower at all times. Joseph Moore continued his search, his sense of dread growing with every silent room he entered. He made his way up the winding staircase to the lamp room at the very top of the tower. The lamp itself was clean and polished, the lenses immaculate. It was fully supplied with oil, ready to be lit. Everything was in perfect working order. But the men who were supposed to be tending it were gone. Moore returned to the cliff's edge and signaled back to the Hesperus. He had found no men, no bodies, no answers. He had found only a ghost station, a place of profound and unsettling emptiness. The 3 lighthouse keepers of Eilean Moore had vanished from a locked room on a tiny, isolated rock in the middle of the ocean, leaving behind only an uneaten meal, an overturned chair, and a mystery that would endure for over 100 years. After Joseph Moore's initial, terrifying survey of the abandoned lighthouse, Captain Harvey of the Hesperus sent 2 more sailors ashore to conduct a more thorough search of the small island. The men, now joined by Moore, fanned out across the desolate, windswept landscape of Eilean Moore. They were looking for any sign of the 3 missing keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. But the island, a mere 40 acres of rock and rough grass, offered up no secrets. They searched the small chapel ruins, the sheep pens, every crevice and hollow. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and no indication that any accident had befallen the men on the island itself. The focus of the investigation then shifted to the physical evidence at the lighthouse compound. The scene was a collection of bizarre and contradictory clues that seemed to defy any single, rational explanation. The discovery that only one set of oilskins remained was deeply perplexing. It strongly implied that two men had gone outside, while one had stayed behind. But why would two men venture out into what must have been a violent storm, leaving the third man behind? And why would that third man, Donald MacArthur, a notoriously hot-headed brawler who was known to hate the wind and the sea, be the one to go out without his protective gear? It made no sense. The most significant clues, however, were found on the west landing, the more sheltered of the island's two platforms. Here, the search party found evidence of the storm's incredible, almost supernatural power. A supply crate, which had been securely fastened to a recess in the rock over 100 feet above sea level, had been broken open, its contents scattered. Heavy iron railings along the path leading to the landing were bent and twisted out of shape. A massive block of stone, weighing over a ton, had been dislodged and moved, and a lifeline, a heavy rope that ran along the path to provide a handhold during storms, had been torn from its stanchions. The scene painted a picture of a wave of almost unimaginable size and force, a rogue wave that had swept over that side of the island with a power that defied belief. This discovery led to the first and most enduring official theory. The Northern Lighthouse Board, in its final report, concluded that the three men had been swept away by a freak wave. The theory posited that, on the afternoon of December 15th, the day the storm hit, two of the keepers, likely Marshall and Duckett, had gone down to the west landing to secure the supply crate, fearing it would be washed away by the rising seas. The third keeper, MacArthur, had been left on watch. When his two colleagues did not return, he, in a moment of concern, left his post to go and check on them. As he reached the landing, a massive, unexpected wave surged over the cliff, engulfing all three men and sweeping them into the churning, violent sea. This theory would account for the overturned chair in the kitchen, a man jumping up in a hurry to go check on his friends, and the single set of oilskins left behind, belonging to the man who had rushed out in a panic without taking the time to put on his gear. This rogue wave theory was neat, logical, and provided a rational, if tragic, explanation for the men's disappearance. It became the official story, the accepted version of events that was reported to the public. But for many, including Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board who conducted the official investigation, the theory was full of holes. Muirhead, a man who knew the keepers and the islands intimately, found it almost impossible to believe that three experienced, professional keepers would all be so foolish as to be caught in such a way. It was a fundamental violation of their training and their character. Seasoned mariners and lighthouse keepers were deeply respectful of the sea's power. The idea that all three would abandon their posts and be on the exposed landing during a violent storm seemed incredible. And why would they be trying to secure a supply crate in the middle of a gale? Their own safety and the keeping of the light would have been their only priorities. The most compelling and haunting piece of evidence, however, was found inside the lighthouse itself. The keeper's logbook. The final entries, written in the neat, professional hand of Second Assistant Thomas Marshall, provided a chilling, day-by-day account of the men's final days, a narrative that seemed to contradict the simple explanation of a freak accident. The logbook entries began to take on a strange and ominous tone on December 12th. On that day, Marshall wrote of a severe storm, the likes of which he had never seen before. He wrote, "Severe winds the likes of which I have never seen in 20 years. This was strange, as there were no reported storms in the area on that date. The major storm did not hit until the 15th. He also noted that James Duckett, the stoic, veteran principal keeper, had been very quiet, and that Donald MacArthur, the tough, seasoned sailor, had been crying. This was a shocking and completely uncharacteristic description. For a man like MacArthur to be weeping was almost unthinkable. What could have terrified these three hardened men so profoundly? The entry for December 13th continued in the same vein. Marshall wrote that the storm was still raging and that all three men had been praying. He wrote, "Storm continued through the night. Wind shifted west to northwest. We are all praying." Again, this was highly unusual. Lighthouse keepers were not prone to dramatic, emotional entries in their official logs. The log was for recording weather conditions and maintenance, not personal fears and prayers. The entry for December 14th was a single cryptic sentence. Noon. Sea calm. God is over all. The storm, it seemed, had passed. And then, on December 15th, there was the final, baffling entry. The log noted that the light had been extinguished. This was the ultimate failure for a lighthouse keeper, the one thing they were trained at all costs to prevent. The log entry was logged at dinner time. After that, the logbook was silent. These log entries are the heart of the Flannan Isles mystery. They seem to tell a story of a profound psychological terror, a storm that was perhaps not meteorological, but something else entirely. They describe three experienced men, trapped on an isolated rock, being driven to a state of abject fear by something they saw or experienced, something that was powerful enough to make a hardened seaman weep. The official inquiry, however, chose to dismiss these log entries. The Northern Lighthouse Board, in its final report, suggested that the entries were not a factual account, but a work of fiction, perhaps a story Marshall had been writing, or a fabrication made up after the fact to create a more sensational mystery. This dismissal has been a source of intense debate ever since. Were the logs a true account of a terrifying, paranormal event that drove the men to their deaths? Or was the board simply trying to create a neat, rational explanation for an event that was deeply embarrassing and damaging to their reputation? The logbook, the only voice the men left behind, was officially silenced, its strange and terrifying testimony discounted in favor of a more palatable, if flawed, explanation. The mystery of what truly happened on Eilean Moor was left to fester, a ghost story told in the quiet, methodical handwriting of a man who had vanished from the world. The official rogue wave theory, while providing a tidy, rational explanation for the disappearance of the three keepers, has never sat well with many researchers, historians, and those familiar with the unforgiving nature of the sea and the disciplined nature of the men who tend its lights. The inconsistencies in the official account, the unlikelihood of three veteran keepers breaking protocol so catastrophically, the strange and emotional logbook entries, and the sheer, almost unbelievable power of a wave needed to wreak such havoc over 100 feet above sea level, have left the door wide open for a host of alternative theories. These theories range from the plausible and criminal to the deeply paranormal, each attempting to explain the collection of bizarre clues left behind at the abandoned lighthouse. One of the most enduring alternative theories suggests that the men were not victims of nature, but of foul play. This theory posits that the men were murdered and their bodies disposed of in the sea. The motive for such a crime has been the subject of much speculation. Perhaps the men had stumbled upon something they shouldn't have, like a shipwreck carrying illicit cargo, or a clandestine meeting between foreign agents. In the turbulent political climate of the turn of the 20th century, with rivalries between Britain, Germany, and other European powers simmering, the remote Flannan Isles could have been a perfect, secret rendezvous point for spies. If the keepers had witnessed such a meeting, they would have been a liability that needed to be permanently silenced. This would explain the need for a clean, traceless crime, with the bodies disappearing into the vastness of the Atlantic. A more intimate and psychologically driven murder theory focuses on the internal dynamics of the three men themselves. Life on a remote lighthouse was a pressure cooker. Three men, cooped up in a confined space for weeks on end, with only each other for company, could easily fall prey to cabin fever. Tensions could escalate, and minor disagreements could fester into violent confrontations. The logbook entries, with their descriptions of James Duckett being very quiet and Donald MacArthur weeping, could be interpreted not as fear of an external threat, but as evidence of a profound psychological breakdown within the group. In this scenario, one of the men, perhaps the notoriously hot-tempered Donald MacArthur, could have snapped. A fight could have erupted, leading to the deaths of the other two keepers. The killer, consumed by guilt and madness, would have then thrown the bodies of his colleagues, and then himself, into the sea from the high cliffs. This would account for the overturned chair, a sign of a sudden eruption of violence, and the strange log entries, a record of the escalating psychological tension. It is a grim and tragic theory, but one that is well within the bounds of human psychology. Another, more outlandish criminal theory involves a ghost ship or pirates. It has been suggested that a group of marauders could have landed on the island, murdered the 3 keepers, and stolen the lighthouse's supply of mercury. In the early 20th century, the massive Fresnel lenses of lighthouses often floated on a large basin of liquid mercury to reduce friction and allow them to turn smoothly. This mercury was incredibly valuable. While there is no historical record of pirates operating in the area at that time, the theory persists, a romantic, if unlikely, explanation for the men's disappearance. Beyond the criminal theories, there are the paranormal and supernatural explanations, which have been a part of the story since the very beginning. The Flannan Isles have a long history of folklore and superstition. They were believed to be inhabited by spirits and little people, and were considered a place of bad omen. The strange logbook entries, with their references to a storm that didn't exist and the profound, weeping terror of the keepers, are seen by many as the central evidence for a supernatural encounter. In this interpretation, the men were not driven mad by isolation, but by something they witnessed, something so terrifying and unnatural that it broke their minds. Was it the ghost of an ancient mariner? Was it a mythical sea monster rising from the depths? Or was it something else entirely? The storm described by Thomas Marshall could have been a psychic or spiritual storm, not a meteorological one. His final cryptic entry, "God is over all," could be seen as a final, desperate prayer in the face of an incomprehensible, malevolent force. The men, driven insane by what they had seen, could have simply walked out of the lighthouse and into the sea, a collective, madness-induced suicide. A more modern paranormal theory, which has gained popularity in recent decades, suggests an alien abduction. This theory interprets the strange events through a science fiction lens. The storm that Marshall described could have been the arrival of a UFO. The weeping of the hardened keeper, MacArthur, could have been a reaction of pure terror to an alien presence. The final log entry could signify the moment of their abduction. This theory, while having no basis in physical evidence, provides an explanation for the most baffling aspect of the case: the complete and total vanishing of 3 men from a secure, isolated location. In this narrative, they were not swept away by a wave or murdered by a fellow keeper. They were taken, lifted from the island by an intelligence far beyond our own. Each of these theories, from the mundane to the fantastic, is an attempt to impose a narrative on a set of facts that refuse to cohere into a single, sensible story. The rogue wave theory, while the most officially accepted, fails to account for the psychological state of the men as described in the logbook. The murder-suicide theory fails to explain the evidence of the storm damage on the West Landing. The supernatural and alien theories, while providing an explanation for the inexplicable, require a leap of faith that goes beyond the available evidence. The Flannan Isles mystery is a perfect storm of ambiguity. The location is remote and myth-haunted. The physical evidence is contradictory, and the only written account, the logbook, is either a factual record of a terrifying event or a complete fabrication. The story has become a mirror, reflecting back the beliefs and biases of whoever is looking into it. A pragmatist sees a tragic industrial accident. A psychologist sees a case of cabin fever gone horribly wrong. And a believer in the paranormal sees definitive proof of a world beyond our own. The truth of what happened to Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur is likely lost forever, carried away on the same wind and waves that scoured their lonely island home clean of any definitive answers. Of course, here is the fourth and final part of the story, concluding the case and exploring its enduring. The enduring power of the Flannan Isles mystery lies not in any single theory, but in the perfect, unsettling balance between them. For over a century, the story has resisted a definitive explanation, remaining a historical enigma that continues to capture the imagination. The official report from the Northern Lighthouse Board, blaming a freak wave, has done little to quell the endless speculation. In fact, for many, the board's quick and tidy conclusion, especially its dismissal of the disturbing logbook entries, only adds to the sense of a cover-up, an official story designed to protect a reputation rather than uncover a truth. The logbook remains the single most debated and mysterious artifact of the entire case. Is it, as the board claimed, a work of fiction, a Gothic tale concocted by Thomas Marshall during the long, lonely hours of his watch? Or is it a genuine, first-hand account of the keeper's descent into terror? Modern analysis of the log has only deepened the debate. Some researchers claim the handwriting and tone are consistent with Marshall's other official entries, suggesting it is a factual record. Others point to its unusually dramatic and emotional language as proof that it must be a fabrication, completely out of character for a professional lighthouse keeper's log. The truth of the logbook is the truth of the case itself. It is likely to remain forever unknowable. The story of the vanishing keepers has had a profound and lasting cultural impact, inspiring poems, songs, and even an opera. The most famous of these is the 1912 poem Flannan Isle by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, which dramatically recounts the discovery of the abandoned lighthouse and ends with the haunting lines. We seem to be waiting for something to happen, though we know not what that something may be, and we look at each other with questioning eyes, and we hear the seabirds crying and the rhythmic wash of the sea. Gibson's poem cemented the story in the popular consciousness, transforming the three keepers from historical figures into archetypes of a classic ghost story. It captured the essence of the mystery, the profound sense of unease, the unanswered questions, and the overwhelming, oppressive presence of the sea itself. In the modern era, the case continues to be a subject of fascination. The development of advanced oceanographic modeling has allowed scientists to study the potential for rogue waves in the North Atlantic. These studies have confirmed that freak waves, sometimes reaching heights of over 100 feet, are a rare but very real phenomenon. This lends a new scientific credibility to the official theory. It is entirely possible that a wave of such magnitude could have struck the island, creating the damage seen at the West Landing and sweeping the three men away. However, this scientific possibility still doesn't fully resolve the human element of the mystery. It doesn't explain the strange logbook entries or the violation of protocol by three experienced keepers. The case remains a perfect example of a situation where even the most plausible rational explanation feels somehow incomplete, as if it is missing a crucial piece of the human story. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was automated in 1971, and the island of Eilean Mor is once again uninhabited by humans. The tower still stands, a silent, white sentinel against the gray Atlantic sky. It is a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the mystery, a dark tourist destination that continues to draw people to its lonely shores. The story of what happened there in December of 1900 has become part of the island's identity, a permanent ghost that haunts its cliffs and shores. Ultimately, the vanishing of Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur is a story about the awesome and indifferent power of nature, and the terrifying fragility of human life in the face of it. But it is also a story about the power of ambiguity. The lack of a definitive answer is what gives the story its enduring life. It is a historical void that we can fill with our own fears and beliefs. It allows for the possibility of pirates, ghosts, sea monsters, and aliens, but it also allows for the simple, tragic reality of a monstrous wave and a moment of human error. The three men were swallowed by the sea, leaving behind only a few strange clues and a legacy of unending questions. They have become less like historical figures and more like characters in a myth, their true story lost to the wind and the waves. They are a permanent reminder that even in a world of science and reason, there are still mysteries that defy our understanding, pockets of darkness on our maps where the known world ends and the vast, terrifying sea of the unknown begins. Their silent, abandoned post stands as a monument to one of the most perfect and unsettling disappearances in maritime history. The mystery of the Flannan Isles is a story of a collective vanishing from an isolated rock in the sea. But some mysteries are not about a collective event, but about a single, solitary individual, a man who appears from nowhere, carrying a name that is not his own and a secret that will baffle the world for decades. The unexplained death of Elisa Lam. There are certain places on Earth that seem to function as reservoirs for human misery, buildings whose walls have absorbed so much sorrow and violence that they become characters in the tragedies that unfold within them. The Cecil Hotel, a hulking, Beaux-Arts monolith looming over the desperate streets of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, is one such place. Since its construction in the 1920s, it has been a magnet for the transient, the forgotten, and the damned. It has been the scene of countless suicides, a temporary home to notorious serial killers like Richard Ramirez and Jack Unterweger, and the last known address for many who simply vanished into the city's indifferent sprawl. It is a place with a dark and heavy history, a building that seems to hum with the low, persistent frequency of human despair. And in January of 2013, this infamous hotel would become the setting for a mystery so bizarre, so tragic, and so profoundly modern that it would captivate and terrify a global audience. The young woman who walked through its doors on January 26, 2013, seemed a world away from the hotel's sordid reputation. Her name was Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old student from Vancouver, Canada. She was bright, adventurous, and possessed a searching, curious spirit. She was in the middle of a solo trip down the west coast of the United States, a journey of self-discovery she was chronicling on her personal blog, a digital diary filled with her musings on art, fashion, literature, and her own struggles with depression and bipolar disorder. Her writing was raw, honest, and often poignant, a portrait of a young mind grappling with the big questions of life and her place in it. Her trip was a bold step, an attempt to push the boundaries of her own comfort zone and see the world on her own terms. She had traveled by train and bus, making her way through San Diego before arriving in the vast, chaotic landscape of Los Angeles. She chose the Cecil Hotel for its affordability and its central location. It had recently been rebranded, with a portion of it operating as a youth hostel called Stay on Main, an attempt to attract a new generation of travelers and shed its dark past. Elisa initially checked into a shared dorm room, but after a few days, her roommates reportedly complained of her odd behavior, and she was moved to a private room on the 5th floor. For the first few days of her stay, everything seemed normal. Elisa kept in daily contact with her parents back in British Columbia. It was a strict family rule. She had to call home every single day of her trip, without fail. These calls were a lifeline, a way for her family to track her progress and ensure her safety. She followed the routine diligently. She explored the city, visited a local art museum, and bought books and music at a store called the Last Bookstore, bringing her purchases back to her hotel room. She was an ordinary tourist, soaking in the sights and sounds of a new city, her journey unfolding just as planned. But on January 31st, 2013, the daily phone call never came. Her parents, knowing how uncharacteristic this was, immediately knew something was wrong. A day passed, then another with no word. The silence was absolute and terrifying. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. The initial LAPD investigation began at the Cecil Hotel. Officers searched her room, but found nothing to suggest foul play or a struggle. Her belongings, her laptop, her wallet, her identification, and the books she had just purchased were all there. It was as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The police began a search of the hotel, a massive, labyrinthine building with over 700 rooms and a long history of hiding dark secrets. They used search dogs, but the dogs reportedly lost her scent in the hallway outside her room. They searched the roof but found the access doors locked and the alarms armed. They checked the surrounding area, the desperate, chaotic streets of Skid Row, a place where a person could easily vanish, but they found no trace of her. The case quickly went cold. Elisa Lam, a young woman in constant digital and telephonic contact with the world, had disappeared without a single witness and without leaving a single clue as to her whereabouts. For 2 weeks, the investigation stalled. Her family, frantic with worry, flew to Los Angeles to aid in the search, plastering the city with missing person flyers bearing their daughter's smiling face. The police were at a dead end. They had no suspects, no leads, and no idea what could have happened to the young Canadian tourist. Desperate to generate some public interest and hoping that someone might recognize her, the LAPD decided to release a piece of evidence they had recovered from the hotel, the last known footage of Elisa Lam. It was a grainy, silent video, captured by a security camera inside one of the hotel's elevators on the night she disappeared. The police hoped it would be a key to solving the mystery. They had no idea that they were about to unleash a document so strange, so disturbing, and so profoundly ambiguous that it would turn the case into a global internet sensation and one of the most unsettling viral videos of all time. The video, just under 4 minutes long, was not a record of a crime, but a portrait of a mind in some kind of unnameable crisis. It shows Elisa entering the elevator, her behavior immediately strange and erratic. She presses multiple buttons, then steps back into the corner, as if hiding from someone. She then peeks out of the open elevator door, looking cautiously up and down the hallway. She steps out, then back in. She moves in a strange, almost choreographed way, her hands making a series of bizarre, twisting gestures, as if she is having a conversation with someone, or something, that is not there. At one point, she stands just outside the elevator as the doors, which have been inexplicably held open, finally close. She is not seen again. The release of this video changed everything. It was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the final, terrifying moments of a person's descent into an unknown psychological abyss. It asked more questions than it answered. Was she being pursued? Was there someone just out of frame, a threat that only she could see? Was she having a psychotic episode, her bipolar disorder manifesting in a terrifying break from reality? Or was she playing a strange game with an unseen participant? The video was a perfect, silent horror film, and the world was its terrified audience. The search for Elisa Lam was no longer just a local missing person case. It was now a global mystery, a crowdsourced investigation into the meaning of a ghostly dance in a hotel elevator. And the dark, sordid history of the Cecil Hotel was about to claim another victim. The release of the elevator footage on February 13, 2013, turned the search for Elisa Lam into an international obsession. The video was uploaded to YouTube and immediately went viral, accumulating millions of views in a matter of days. A global army of amateur sleuths began a forensic-level analysis of the 4-minute clip, a crowdsourced investigation that dwarfed the official police effort. Every frame was scrutinized, every gesture debated, every shadow analyzed. The video was a Rorschach test, and people saw in it whatever their own fears and beliefs dictated. The theories that emerged were vast and varied. Many focused on a rational, if tragic, explanation. Elisa had a documented history of bipolar disorder and depression, and she had been prescribed a cocktail of medications to manage her condition. Her strange behavior in the elevator, the frantic button pushing, the strange hand gestures, the apparent conversation with an unseen person, all of these were consistent with a severe psychotic episode. Perhaps she had not been taking her medication correctly, or perhaps the stress and isolation of solo travel had triggered a manic or paranoid state. In this view, the video was not a record of a crime, but a heartbreaking document of a young woman losing her grip on reality. This theory was supported by her own blog posts, where she wrote openly about her struggles with mental illness. She described her slumps, her feelings of being lost, and her constant battle to maintain a sense of stability. The trip itself could have been a part of this struggle, a desperate attempt to outrun her own inner demons. The video, then, was the tragic climax of that struggle, a final public manifestation of a private war she had been fighting for years. But other observers saw something far more sinister in the footage. They pointed to the strange behavior of the elevator itself. The doors remain open for an unusually long time, almost as if they are being held by someone just out of frame, or as if the door hold button had been pressed. Some viewers claimed to see the shadow of another person, or a strange, fleeting reflection in the elevator's mirrored panel. The way Elisa peeks out of the door and then quickly retreats back into the corner suggested she was hiding from a real, physical threat. Her bizarre hand gestures were interpreted by some as a form of sign language, a desperate attempt to communicate with someone down the hall. In this narrative, the video was not a portrait of psychosis, but a record of the final, terrifying moments before an abduction or murder. The supernatural theories were even more rampant, fueled by the Cecil Hotel's dark and sordid history. Some claimed that Elisa was interacting with a ghost, a victim of the hotel's long and violent past. They pointed to the fact that her hands and feet appeared to be unnaturally distorted in some frames of the video, a supposed sign of demonic possession. The story of her death became intertwined with the legend of the hotel itself, turning her into the latest victim of a building that was, in the minds of many, genuinely evil, a place that preyed on the vulnerable. While the world was obsessively debating the meaning of the elevator video, the residents and guests of the Cecil Hotel began to complain about a problem with the water. The water pressure on the upper floors was low, and worse, the tap water had begun to taste strange. It had a sweet, almost sickening flavor, and it came out of the faucets with a murky, blackish tint. For over 2 weeks, guests had been bathing, brushing their teeth, and drinking water that was becoming increasingly foul. On the morning of February 19, 2013, 19 days after Elisa Lam was last seen, a hotel maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez was sent to the roof to investigate the source of the water problem. The roof housed 4 large, cylindrical water cisterns, massive tanks that supplied the entire hotel. Lopez noticed that the main hatch on one of the tanks was open, which was unusual. He grabbed a ladder, climbed to the top of the 10-foot tank, and peered down into the dark water inside. At first, he saw nothing. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw something pale at the bottom of the tank. It was Elisa Lam. Her naked body was floating face up in the murky water, her clothes and her room key at the bottom of the tank beside her. She had been in the tank for nearly 3 weeks, her decomposing body the source of the hotel's contaminated water. The discovery was a gruesome and horrifying end to the search, but it only served to deepen the mystery. How had she gotten into the water tank in the first place? The hotel roof was supposed to be a secure area. The main access doors were locked, and a secondary fire escape route was equipped with an alarm that, hotel staff insisted, had never been triggered. To get to the tanks, a person would have to bypass these security measures or have a key, and the tanks themselves were a formidable obstacle. They were 10 feet high with no external ladder. To get to the top, a person would have to climb up the side. The main hatch, a heavy, circular piece of metal, would have been difficult for a small woman like Elisa to lift and open by herself from the outside. And once inside, how could the hatch have been closed again from within? It seemed almost impossible for her to have gotten into the tank on her own. This led immediately back to the theory of foul play. Someone had murdered Elisa, perhaps in her room or elsewhere in the hotel, and had then taken her body to the roof and dumped it in the water tank to hide the evidence. This would explain how she bypassed the locked doors. Her killer had a key. It would explain how she got into the tank. Her killer had lifted her body and placed it inside. And it would explain her strange behavior in the elevator. She was fleeing from the person who would ultimately kill her. But this theory also had its own problems. The official autopsy report found no signs of physical trauma on Elisa's body, no evidence of sexual assault, and no drugs or alcohol in her system other than her prescribed medication and trace amounts of over-the-counter painkillers. If she had been murdered, the killer had done so without leaving a single mark on her body. And how could a killer have dragged a body through the hotel, up to the roof, and deposited it in a water tank without being seen by a single person or a single security camera? The police, faced with these contradictions, leaned towards the official explanation offered by the coroner. The cause of death was ruled as an accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. In this official narrative, Elisa, in the midst of a severe psychotic episode, had made her way to the roof, climbed into the water tank herself, and had been unable to get out, eventually drowning. It was a tragic accident, the final, fatal act of a mind in crisis. But for the millions of people who had followed the case, this explanation felt deeply, profoundly unsatisfying. It left too many questions unanswered, too many strange coincidences unexplained. The mystery of what happened in the elevator had been replaced by the even greater mystery of what happened on the roof. The official ruling of accidental drowning by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was intended to bring a close to the case of Elisa Lam. The narrative they presented was a simple, if tragic, one. A young woman with a history of severe bipolar disorder, likely off her medication or experiencing a manic episode, had a break from reality. In her psychotic state, she made her way to the hotel roof, climbed into a water tank for reasons that will never be known, and drowned. Her strange behavior in the elevator was the primary evidence for this state of mind. The case was closed, but for the global community of online investigators who had become obsessed with the mystery, and for anyone who looked closely at the details, this official explanation was riddled with holes and inconsistencies. It seemed less like a definitive conclusion and more like the neatest, simplest story to close a deeply perplexing and high-profile case. The first major problem with the accidental death theory was the physical logistics of getting to and into the water tank. The hotel roof was a restricted area. There were two primary points of access from the inside: a locked door that required a key only available to hotel staff, and a fire escape that was equipped with an alarm. Hotel staff testified that the alarm never went off on the night Elisa disappeared. This raises a critical question. How did she get onto the roof? Did she somehow obtain a staff key? Did she find the door propped open by chance? Or was the alarm system faulty? Or, as proponents of the foul play theory suggest, was she taken to the roof by someone who had authorized access, such as a hotel employee? The water tanks themselves presented an even greater challenge. They were massive, 10-foot-tall cylinders with smooth sides and no external ladders. For a small woman like Elisa, who was 5 feet 5 inches, to climb to the top would have been an incredibly difficult feat of athleticism, especially in a state of psychosis. Once at the top, she would have had to lift and move the heavy, cumbersome maintenance hatch, which weighed around 20 pounds. And the most perplexing detail of all, the maintenance worker who found her body reported that the hatch was closed. How could Elisa have climbed into the tank and then closed the heavy lid from the inside? It seemed physically impossible. These logistical hurdles became the central focus for those who believed she was murdered. In the foul play narrative, these obstacles disappear. A killer or killers could have easily overpowered her, taken her to the roof, lifted her body into the tank, and then replaced the lid, creating a perfect, hidden grave. The lack of trauma on her body could be explained by a nonviolent method of murder, such as suffocation, before she was placed in the water. The Cecil Hotel, with its long history of crime and its transient population, was the perfect place for such a crime to occur and go unnoticed. The killer could have been another guest, a stranger she met, or even a hotel employee with access to the entire building. The toxicology report also became a point of intense debate. While it found no illegal drugs or alcohol, it did reveal that Elisa had not been taking her bipolar medication consistently. The report noted trace amounts of her prescribed antidepressants and mood stabilizers, but not at a therapeutic level. This detail was used to support the official theory of a psychotic break. However, the report also noted that it did not test for all of her prescribed medications, leaving open the possibility that she was taking some but not others. Furthermore, some online researchers have questioned the thoroughness of the toxicology screening, suggesting that certain date rape drugs or other fast-acting compounds might not have been tested for or could have degraded in the water over the 3 weeks her body was submerged. The elevator video, the very piece of evidence used to support the psychosis theory, was also re-examined with a skeptical eye. Online sleuths discovered that the version released by the LAPD had been tampered with. The timestamp in the corner of the video is obscured, and nearly a minute of footage appears to have been edited out. Why was the video altered before its public release? Was it a simple, innocent edit to shorten the file size, or was it a deliberate attempt to conceal something or someone else in the footage? The missing minute has become a source of endless speculation. Did it show another person? Did it show Elisa being confronted or forced from the elevator? This single act of unexplained editing has fueled countless conspiracy theories, suggesting a cover-up by either the hotel or the police themselves. Beyond the major theories of accident and foul play, a host of more esoteric explanations have flourished, particularly online. Some have noted the eerie similarities between Elisa Lam's death and the plot of the 2005 horror film Dark Water, in which a mother and daughter move into a haunted apartment building and discover that they're black. Foul-tasting tap water is the result of a young girl's body decomposing in the rooftop water tank. The parallels are so striking that some have suggested a copycat crime, though there is no evidence to support this. Another strange coincidence that has fascinated online communities is the name of a tuberculosis test used in the Skid Row area at the time of Elisa's death. The test was called the LAM-ELISA lipoarabinomannan enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. The fact that this test, being administered just blocks from the Cecil Hotel, contained her exact name is a coincidence so bizarre that it has been woven into numerous conspiracy theories, suggesting she was a biological test subject or was involved in some kind of government experiment. Each of these theories, from the logical to the outlandish, is an attempt to impose order on a set of facts that are fundamentally chaotic and contradictory. The case of Elisa Lam is a perfect storm of high strangeness, a puzzle where every piece is shrouded in ambiguity. Was she a victim of a terrible mental illness that led her to a tragic, accidental death? Or was she the victim of a cunning killer who exploited the hotel's dark reputation and a flawed investigation to get away with murder? The official story, while providing a neat conclusion, fails to satisfy the nagging questions raised by the evidence. The locked doors, the impossible climb, the closed hatch, the edited video. These are the details that keep the mystery alive, the loose threads that prevent the story from ever being neatly tied up. The case remains a battleground of competing narratives, a story where the line between tragic reality and dark urban legend is almost impossible to draw. The legacy of Elisa Lam is not just that of an unsolved mystery, but of a profound cultural moment. Her death became one of the first and most powerful examples of a true crime case being shaped, driven, and ultimately defined by the internet. The LAPD's decision to release the elevator footage was a catalyst that they could never have anticipated. They were simply looking for a lead, but they inadvertently created a global phenomenon. The video, with its raw, unsettling, and deeply ambiguous nature, was perfectly suited for the viral age. It was a visual puzzle box that invited endless interpretation, and the burgeoning online true crime communities seized upon it with a fervent, almost religious, intensity. This global, crowdsourced investigation had a number of significant consequences. On one hand, it ensured that Elisa Lam's story would not be forgotten. The immense public pressure and scrutiny likely forced the LAPD and the Cecil Hotel to be more transparent than they might have been otherwise. The online community kept the case alive, constantly pushing for new information and re-examining the known facts. They became a de facto cold case squad, a digital army of citizen journalists determined to find justice for a woman they had never met. On the other hand, the online frenzy also created a storm of misinformation and harmful speculation that often veered into the absurd. The most infamous example of this was the intense harassment directed at a Mexican death metal musician named Morbid. For a brief period, online sleuths became convinced that he was Elisa's killer. The evidence was flimsy and circumstantial. He had once posted a video of himself at the Cecil Hotel, and some of his song lyrics and music videos had dark, gothic themes that some interpreted as clues. This online mob descended upon him, sending him death threats and flooding his social media with accusations. He was eventually cleared by the police, but the experience was a terrifying ordeal that nearly ruined his life. It was a stark and powerful lesson in the dangers of online witch hunts, and the fine line between collaborative investigation and irresponsible vigilantism. The case also had a lasting and profound impact on the reputation of the Cecil Hotel. While the hotel already had a dark and sordid history, the Elisa Lam case cemented its status as a place of genuine, modern horror. It became a dark tourist destination, a place people would visit not for its amenities, but for its ghosts. The story has been the subject of numerous documentaries, podcasts, and even served as the inspiration for a season of the television series American Horror Story. The hotel, unable to escape its association with the tragedy, eventually closed for a lengthy period of renovation and rebranding, a desperate attempt to wash away the stain of its most famous and unsettling mystery. For Elisa Lam's family, the legacy of her death is one of unimaginable and unending grief, compounded by the bizarre public nature of their tragedy. They lost their daughter, and then had to watch as her most vulnerable and private moments were turned into a global spectacle. They have maintained their silence since her death, choosing not to engage with the endless speculation, a quiet, dignified retreat from a world that has turned their personal nightmare into a form of public entertainment. In the end, the mystery of what happened to Elisa Lam will likely never be definitively solved. The two most plausible explanations, a tragic accident fueled by a severe psychotic episode, or a cunningly concealed murder, both leave too many questions unanswered. The official narrative of an accidental death fails to adequately explain the logistical impossibilities of her getting into the water tank. The foul play theory, while accounting for those logistics, fails to explain the complete lack of physical evidence of a struggle or an attacker. The truth is likely lost forever in the decaying halls of the Cecil Hotel and the murky, contradictory details of a flawed investigation. Elisa Lam remains a ghost, a figure trapped in the grainy loop of a 4-minute video, forever playing out her strange, silent dance in an elevator. Her story is a uniquely 21st century tragedy. It is a story about mental illness and the failures of our system to protect the vulnerable. It is a story about the dark side of solo travel and the dangers that can await those who seek adventure. And it is a story about the power and the peril of the internet, its ability to create a global community, and its capacity to destroy lives with rumor and speculation. Elisa Lam went to Los Angeles seeking connection and self-discovery. Instead, she found a lonely, terrifying end in a place that has become synonymous with death and despair. Her case is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most horrifying mysteries are not the ones with no clues, but the ones with too many, a collection of bizarre and contradictory facts that refuse to form a coherent narrative, leaving us with nothing but a series of unsettling, unanswerable questions. The tragic mystery of Elisa Lam was contained within the walls of a single infamous hotel. But some mysteries are not confined to a building. They are written across the sky, a brazen act of defiance against the very concept of borders and law, leaving behind a legend that has spanned generations. The Beltway sniper attacks the autumn of 2002 was a time of profound, lingering anxiety in the United States, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area. The psychic wounds of the September 11th attacks, just a year earlier, were still raw. The Pentagon, a symbol of American military might located just across the Potomac River, had been a direct target, and the city lived under a constant low-grade fear of another large-scale terrorist attack. But the terror that was about to descend upon the capital region would be of a different, more insidious kind. It would not come from a grand, symbolic attack, but from a series of quiet, seemingly random acts of violence that would turn the most mundane aspects of daily life into a terrifying game of Russian roulette. The opening act of this bloody saga occurred on the evening of Wednesday, October 2nd, 2002. At 5:20 p.m., a single rifle shot rang out in the parking lot of a Michael's craft store in Aspen Hill, Maryland. The bullet shattered a window, but miraculously, no one was injured. Less than an hour later, at 6:04 p.m., in a different part of the same county, another single shot was fired. This time, it found its mark. James Martin, a 55-year-old analyst for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was shot and killed as he walked across the parking lot of a Shoppers Food Warehouse grocery store. At the time, the two incidents were treated as separate, unrelated crimes, a random act of vandalism and a tragic, but likely isolated, homicide or robbery gone wrong. There was no reason to connect them. That perception would be shattered the following morning. On Thursday, October 3rd, the Phantom Predator who had been testing his weapon the night before began his work in earnest. Over the next 15 hours, he would embark on a killing spree of breathtaking speed and brutality, carving a trail of death and terror across Montgomery County, Maryland, and into the District of Columbia itself. The day of terror began at 7:41 a.m. A 39-year-old landscaper named James Sonny Buchanan Jr. was mowing a lawn at a car dealership in Rockville. A single shot echoed from a wooded area across the street, and Buchanan crumpled to the ground, dead. Just 45 minutes later, at 8:12 a.m., the scene repeated itself. A 54-year-old part-time taxi driver named Premkumar Walekar was pumping gas at a mobile station in Aspen Hill, not far from the scene of the first shooting the previous evening. Again, a single shot and Walekar was killed instantly. The killer was moving, a mobile and efficient angel of death. At 8:37 a.m., less than half an hour after the last murder, a 34-year-old mother named Sarah Ramos was sitting on a bench outside a post office in Silver Spring, waiting for it to open. The single shot that killed her was fired from a distance with lethal precision. Now, law enforcement began to realize the horrifying truth. The shell casings found at each scene were the same. A .223 caliber round, the type used in high-powered rifles like the AR-15. This was not a series of unrelated crimes. A single, highly skilled sniper was at work, moving through the suburbs, picking off ordinary people as they went about their morning routines. A frantic, multi-jurisdictional police response began to coalesce, but they were already hours behind a killer who was constantly in motion. The rampage continued. At 9:58 a.m., a 25-year-old nanny named Lori and Louis Rivera was vacuuming her minivan at a Shell station in Kensington. She was shot and killed. The sniper was now operating in broad daylight, in busy public places with an audacity that was terrifying. The violence was not confined to Maryland. At 2:30 p.m., the sniper crossed into the District of Columbia. A 72-year-old retired carpenter named Pascal Charlot was standing on a street corner on Georgia Avenue. He was shot and killed by a single bullet. The final attack of the day came that night at 9:15 p.m., back in Silver Spring. A 43-year-old woman named Caroline Sewell had just finished shopping at the same Michael's craft store where the very first shot had been fired the day before. As she loaded her purchases into her car, she was shot. But Caroline Sewell was different. She survived. The bullet had missed any vital organs, and she would become the only survivor of that bloody 24-hour period. By the end of October 3rd, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area was in the grip of a panic unlike anything it had ever experienced. 6 people were dead, another critically wounded, all killed by a faceless, nameless sniper who seemed to be able to strike anywhere, at any time with impunity. The victims had nothing in common. They were of different ages, races, and genders. Their only connection was their tragic, random presence in the sniper's crosshairs. The motive was a complete mystery. This wasn't robbery. No money was ever taken. This was something else, something colder and more terrifying. This was murder as a form of pure nihilistic terror. A massive law enforcement task force was quickly assembled, bringing together local police from multiple counties, the Maryland and Virginia State Police, the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF. They were faced with a crime that was a logistical nightmare. The killer was highly mobile, crossing state and county lines with ease. The crime scenes were vast, open public spaces, offering few clues. The only physical evidence they had was the .223 caliber bullet fragments and shell casings. And the only description of the killer's vehicle was a vague and contradictory collection of witness statements. Some had seen a white box truck near the scenes. Others had seen a white van. This white van theory would become the central, and ultimately tragically misleading, focus of the early investigation. A red herring that would allow the real killers to move freely, hidden in plain sight. For the millions of residents of the D.C. area, life ground to a halt. A profound sense of fear permeated every aspect of daily life. Schools went into lockdown, recess was canceled, and children were taught to zigzag across playgrounds. Gas stations put up tarps to shield their customers as they pumped gas. People began to run, not walk, across parking lots. The mundane, everyday landscape of suburban life had become a war zone. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Who was this phantom, and where would he strike next? In the days that followed the initial bloody rampage of October 3rd, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area settled into a new and terrifying reality. The sniper, having made his brutal opening statement, continued his campaign of terror, but his pace became more deliberate, more unpredictable. Each new shooting was a sharp, terrifying punctuation mark in a long, drawn-out sentence of public anxiety. The randomness of the attacks was the key to their psychological power. No one was safe, and every ordinary moment held the potential for sudden, inexplicable death. On October 4th, a 43-year-old woman named Caroline Sewell, who had been shot the previous night, was wounded while loading purchases into her minivan. The same day, a 43-year-old woman and Chapman was shot while shopping in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The sniper was expanding his hunting ground, moving south into Virginia, proving that his reach extended far beyond the Maryland suburbs. The law enforcement task force, now numbering in the hundreds, was struggling. They were drowning in a sea of tips, over 100,000 by the end of the investigation, and chasing the ghost of a white box truck or white van. A lead that was consuming valuable time and resources while leading them nowhere. The sniper or snipers remained a complete enigma. The only clues were the shell casings and the chilling precision of the shots. Ballistic analysis confirmed that all the shootings were from the same weapon, a Bushmaster XM-15 rifle. The shooter was skilled, capable of hitting a human-sized target from a distance of over 100 yards, often with a single fatal shot. As the attacks continued, the sniper began to communicate, to interact with the investigation, turning the campaign of terror into a bizarre and twisted conversation. On October 7th, outside a middle school in Bowie, Maryland, a 13-year-old boy named Aaron Brown was shot and critically wounded as he was being dropped off by his aunt. It was a shocking escalation, the first time a child had been targeted. As police swarmed the scene, they found something new. Near the location where the shot was believed to have been fired, they discovered a shell casing, and beside it, a tarot card. It was the death card. On it, the sniper had written a chilling, taunting message, "Call me God." On the back he had added, "For you, Mr. Police. Code, call me God. Do not release to the press." This was a profound shift in the case. The sniper was not just a killer. He was a manipulator, a performer who was now engaging directly with the police and the media. He craved a name and identity. He was no longer a phantom. He was God. The discovery of the tarot card was a closely guarded secret, held back from the public in the hope that it could be used to identify the killer if he ever called. The shootings continued, each one a new chapter in the city's shared nightmare. On October 9th, a 53-year-old man named Dean Harold Myers was shot and killed while pumping gas in Manassas, Virginia. 2 days later, on October 11th, a 53-year-old man named Kenneth Bridges was killed in the same way at a gas station in Fredericksburg. The pattern was clear. The sniper favored targets who were stationary and exposed, engaged in the mundane, necessary tasks of life. Gas stations, with their open, well-lit spaces, had become his preferred hunting grounds. The sniper's communication became more frequent and more bizarre. After one shooting, a letter was found at the scene. It was a long, rambling, and poorly written diatribe, demanding a ransom of $10 million. The letter was filled with threats of further violence, specifically targeting children. "Your children are not safe, anywhere at any time," it read. The letter also contained a strange postscript. "P.S. If you want to catch us, look for the silver sedan in front of the Home Depot." This was another piece of deliberate misdirection, another attempt to sow chaos and confusion within the investigation. The task force was now dealing with two parallel challenges: trying to physically locate a killer who could be anywhere, and trying to understand the bizarre psychology of a person who saw himself as a god, a terrorist, and a common extortionist all at once. The profile of the killer was a confusing mess of contradictions. Was he a foreign terrorist, as many in the post-9/11 world feared? The .223 caliber round was a military-grade bullet, and the shooter's skill suggested military training. Or was he a domestic extremist, a lone, disgruntled white male, the classic profile of an American serial killer? The demand for money suggested a more traditional criminal motive, but the taunts and the random nature of the violence pointed to something more nihilistic and psychological. The man leading the law enforcement effort was Charles Moose, the chief of the Montgomery County Police Department. Moose became the public face of the investigation, his nightly press conferences a ritual for the terrified citizens of the region. He was a stoic, imposing figure, a man clearly burdened by the immense weight of the crisis. He found himself in an impossible position, forced to communicate directly with the killers via the media, trying to balance the need to inform the public with the need to protect the integrity of the investigation. He would read the sniper's messages aloud on national television, a bizarre and unprecedented form of long-distance negotiation with a killer. On October 19th, after a man was shot and wounded outside a Ponderosa steakhouse in Ashland, Virginia, the snipers left their longest and most revealing communication yet. It was a 3-page letter, found in the woods near the scene. In it, the sniper or snipers expressed frustration that their previous communications had not been taken seriously. They reiterated their demand for $10 million and gave instructions for how the money was to be delivered. But the letter also contained a stunning and crucial clue. To prove that they were the real killers and not a copycat, the writer referred to a previous, unsolved crime. They told the police to check on a murder robbery that had occurred a month earlier in Montgomery, Alabama. This was the break the investigators had been desperate for. It was a tangible, verifiable piece of information that could potentially be traced. FBI agents were immediately dispatched to Montgomery, Alabama. They looked into a recent homicide that matched the description. A liquor store robbery on September 21st in which 2 female employees had been shot. One had died, the other was critically wounded. At the scene of that crime, the police had recovered a fingerprint. The fingerprint belonged to a man who was not the primary suspect in the Alabama case, but whose prints were on file from a previous arrest. As the Alabama authorities ran the print, a name finally emerged from the fog. The print belonged to a 17-year-old Jamaican immigrant named Lee Boyd Malvo. This discovery was a bombshell. It completely shattered the prevailing profile of the killer. The sniper was not a white, middle-aged man. He was a teenager, and the fact that he was so young suggested he was likely not acting alone. The investigation now had a name and a face, and they quickly discovered his connection to a much older, more sinister figure. A 41-year-old Gulf War veteran named John Allen Muhammad. The Phantom finally had an identity, or rather, 2 of them. The identification of Lee Boyd Malvo from a fingerprint left at a murder scene in Alabama was the critical turning point in the entire investigation. It was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire conspiracy. The task force, which had been chasing the ghost of a lone, white male in a white van, now had a completely new and unexpected profile. A 17-year-old boy of Jamaican descent. The immediate assumption was that a teenager could not be acting alone. He had to have an older, more experienced partner. Investigators quickly delved into Malvo's background, and it didn't take them long to find the dominant, controlling figure in his life. A 41-year-old man named John Allen Muhammad. John Allen Muhammad was a man whose life was a portrait of escalating failure and rage. He was a veteran of the Gulf War, where he had been a skilled marksman, earning an expert rifleman's badge. After leaving the military, his life had spiraled downwards. He had gone through a bitter divorce, lost custody of his children, and had a series of failed business ventures. He was filled with a deep and seething resentment against a society he felt had wronged him. He had drifted into the orbit of the Nation of Islam, though his beliefs were a confused and personal mix of black nationalist ideology and a vague anti-government sentiment. He was a man with a grievance, a man looking for a target for his rage. He found a willing and impressionable disciple in Lee Boyd Malvo. Malvo had a difficult and transient childhood, moving between Jamaica and Antigua. He met Muhammad in Antigua when he was just a teenager. Muhammad, a charismatic and imposing figure, became the father figure that Malvo had never had. He took the young, impressionable boy under his wing, indoctrinating him into his world of paranoid ideology and militant training. He essentially adopted Malvo, and the two formed a deeply toxic master and apprentice relationship. Muhammad was the planner, the ideologue, the father. Malvo was the loyal, obedient son, the soldier who would carry out his orders without question. With their identities known, the investigation kicked into high gear. The task force now knew who they were looking for. They discovered that Muhammad had recently purchased a 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, a dark blue, former police cruiser. This was the second critical breakthrough. The white van that had consumed the investigation for weeks had been a massive red herring. The killers had been moving around in a car that was the exact opposite of what the police were looking for. A dark sedan that could easily blend into traffic. The car itself was a key part of their deadly methodology. Muhammad and Malvo had converted the Caprice into a mobile sniper's nest. They had cut a small, circular hole in the trunk, just above the license plate. Malvo, who was small and agile, would lie in the trunk with the Bushmaster rifle. Muhammad would drive. When they selected a target, Muhammad would park the car, and Malvo would aim through the small hole, completely concealed from view. The sound of the single rifle shot would be muffled by the trunk, making it nearly impossible for witnesses to determine where it had come from. After the shot, Muhammad would simply pull away from the curb and merge back into traffic, disappearing in plain sight. It was a simple, brutally effective, and terrifyingly mobile system for committing murder. On October 23, 2002, with the net closing in, the task force made a strategic decision. They went public. Police Chief Charles Moose, in another televised press conference, released the names and descriptions of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. He announced that they were wanted for questioning in connection with the sniper attacks and that they were believed to be driving a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice with New Jersey license plates. The nationwide manhunt was on. The images of Muhammad and Malvo were broadcast on every news channel, their faces now synonymous with the terror that had gripped the nation. The final chapter of the 23-day ordeal played out not in a dramatic shootout, but in the quiet pre-dawn hours at a roadside rest stop. In the early morning of October 24th, a truck driver named Ron Lance was pulling into a rest stop off Interstate 70 in Myersville, Maryland. He spotted a dark blue Caprice that matched the description from the news reports. He looked closer and saw two men sleeping inside. He immediately called the police. Law enforcement from multiple agencies descended on the rest stop with overwhelming force. They used trucks to quietly blockade the exits, trapping the Caprice. SWAT teams, armed with heavy weapons and night vision goggles, surrounded the vehicle. At approximately 3:19 a.m., they moved in. They smashed the car's windows and pulled the two sleeping men out. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were taken into custody without a single shot being fired. The 23-day reign of terror was over. Inside the car, police found the evidence they needed. There was the Bushmaster XM15 rifle, which ballistics tests would quickly confirm as the murder weapon. They found a telescopic sight, a tripod, and a wealth of other evidence, including maps of the D.C. area and a stolen laptop containing digital files that further implicated them. The motive for the attacks, however, remained chillingly unclear. Prosecutors would later argue that the killings were part of a bizarre, multi-phase plan. The first phase was the terror campaign in the D.C. area, designed to create chaos and provide a cover for the second phase, the extortion of $10 million from the government. The final and most horrifying phase of the plan was to use this money to set up a compound in Canada. There, Muhammad planned to recruit and train homeless and orphan boys, indoctrinating them into his ideology and creating a private army of child soldiers who would carry out a new wave of attacks across the country, ushering in his vision of a new, radical society. It was a plan that was both terrifyingly ambitious and deeply delusional, the fantasy of a man who saw himself as a revolutionary leader, a general in a war against a society that had rejected him. The random, innocent victims were not the true targets. They were simply pawns, nameless casualties in his private war. The terror they inflicted was not the goal itself, but merely a means to an end, a way to get the attention and the money he needed to fund his grand, sociopathic vision. The Beltway snipers had been caught, but the story of their bizarre and twisted motivations was only just beginning to come to light. With John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo in custody, a shattered and traumatized Washington, D.C. region breathed a collective sigh of relief. The trials that followed were a complex legal affair, spanning multiple jurisdictions in both Maryland and Virginia, as prosecutors sought to bring the two men to justice for the string of murders they had committed. The trials would also provide a chilling, if incomplete, look into the twisted psychology that had fueled their 23-day rampage. The prosecution's strategy was to try the two men separately. Virginia, which had the death penalty and a reputation for swift justice, was chosen as the venue for the first high-profile trials. John Allen Muhammad was tried first. He presented a bizarre and erratic defense, at one point firing his court-appointed lawyers and choosing to represent himself. He was arrogant and confrontational, cross-examining his surviving victims and the family members of those he had killed. His performance in the courtroom only served to cement his image as a cold, remorseless sociopath. The prosecution laid out the overwhelming evidence against him. The ballistics from the rifle, found in his car, the car itself, which had been converted into a mobile sniper's nest, and the series of taunting notes and phone calls that linked him directly to the crimes. In November 2003, a jury found him guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. The trial of Lee Boyd Malvo was more complex. His defense team argued that he was not a willing participant, but a brainwashed and psychologically abused child. a victim of Muhammad's intense indoctrination. They presented evidence of the profound psychological control Muhammad had exerted over the young, impressionable boy, turning him from an ordinary teenager into a child soldier in a private, delusional war. Malvo himself would later give extensive testimony, both in his own trial and in subsequent interviews, that provided a horrifying inside look into their methodology and motivations. He described how Muhammad had trained him for hours on end with the rifle, how they had selected their victims at random, and how he, Malvo, had been the triggerman in many of the shootings, firing from his concealed position in the trunk of the Caprice. Malvo's testimony revealed the cold, calculated nature of their plan. He confirmed that the ultimate goal was to extort millions from the government to fund Muhammad's larger, revolutionary fantasies. The random killings were a form of psychological terrorism, designed to create a climate of fear so intense that the authorities would have no choice but to pay the ransom. He also confessed to the unsolved murder in Montgomery, Alabama, the very crime that had provided the fingerprint that led to their capture. In the end, the jury in Malvo's Virginia trial convicted him of capital murder, but, largely due to his young age and the evidence of indoctrination, they spared him the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Both men would later face further trials and convictions in Maryland for the murders committed there. The legacy of the Beltway sniper attacks is one of profound, lingering trauma. For 3 weeks, Muhammad and Malvo held a major American metropolitan area hostage, demonstrating with terrifying effectiveness how two individuals with a single rifle and a car could paralyze a society. They fundamentally altered the public's perception of safety. The attacks showed that terror did not require a massive, coordinated plot. It could be delivered from the trunk of a moving car, targeting anyone, at any time, during the most mundane moments of their day. The randomness was the point. The victims were chosen not for who they were, but simply for what they were doing, living their lives. The case also had a significant impact on law enforcement and media relations. The unprecedented and bizarre public negotiations between Police Chief Charles Moose and the snipers, conducted via the nightly news, highlighted the complex challenges of managing a media-saturated crisis. The initial and tragically incorrect focus on a white van served as a powerful lesson in the dangers of tunnel vision and the unreliability of eyewitness testimony in a fast-moving, high-stress situation. John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection in Virginia on November 10, 2009. He went to his death without ever expressing remorse or offering a full, coherent explanation for his actions. Lee Boyd Malvo continues to serve his multiple life sentences. In the years since his conviction, he has given numerous interviews, expressing a deep and seemingly genuine remorse for his role in the killings. He has provided invaluable insight into the manipulative power of his former mentor and the dark, psychological journey that turned him from a lost boy into a serial killer. The Beltway sniper attacks remain a dark chapter in American history, a story of how two broken individuals, fueled by a toxic mix of personal grievance and delusional ideology, were able to terrorize a nation. The motives were a tangled mess of extortion, revenge, and a grandiose, revolutionary fantasy. But for the 10 people who were killed and the many others who were wounded, the complex why was irrelevant. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, their lives stolen or irrevocably altered by a bullet that came from nowhere, a final, terrifying message from a man who had declared war on the world itself. The silence that followed each shot was the sound of a city holding its breath, a silence that would echo for years to come. The terror of the Beltway snipers was a mobile nightmare, a threat that could appear anywhere along a highway. But some mysteries are tied to a single, static place, a location so remote and so isolated that it becomes a character in the story itself, a silent witness to a collective vanishing that has baffled historians for over a century. The Black Dahlia murder Los Angeles in the winter of 1947 was a city teeming with ghosts. The Second World War had ended just 2 years prior, and the city was a supercharged magnet for the hopeful and the broken, a place where millions came to chase the shimmering, intoxicating dream of Hollywood fame, only to find themselves lost in the city's sprawling, indifferent reality. It was a landscape of stark, almost violent, contrasts. The sun-drenched glamour of the movie studios and the dark, transient world of flop houses and dimly lit cocktail bars. It was a city that manufactured dreams and nightmares in equal measure, a place where a person's identity was a fluid, malleable thing, and where a young woman with stars in her eyes could vanish into the smog and be forgotten. And on a chilly January morning, in a vacant, weed-choked lot in a quiet residential neighborhood, the city would be confronted with a nightmare so artistic in its brutality and so profound in its mystery that it would become a permanent and defining scar on its history. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a local woman named Betty Berzinger was walking down Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park neighborhood with her 3-year-old daughter. The area was still under development, a mix of neat, middle-class homes and empty lots waiting for the post-war housing boom to fill them. As she passed one of these vacant lots, she saw something lying in the tall grass just a few feet from the sidewalk. At first, she thought it was a discarded mannequin from a department store, one that had been broken in half. The skin was so pale it looked like porcelain, and the body was posed in such a strange, deliberate way that it didn't seem real. She moved closer, and the horrific reality of what she was seeing crashed down upon her. It was not a mannequin. It was the body of a woman. Betty Berzinger grabbed her daughter and ran to the nearest house, where she called the police. The first officers to arrive on the scene were met with a sight so gruesome and so bizarre that it was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The body was that of a young woman, lying on her back in the damp grass. She was completely naked, her body scrubbed clean, with no trace of blood on or around her, suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and her body drained of blood before being dumped. The two halves of her body had been expertly severed at the waist with a clinical surgical precision. Her arms were raised and bent at the elbows. Her legs were spread apart in a posed, almost doll-like position. The most horrifying detail, however, was her face. The killer had used a knife to slice her mouth from ear to ear, creating a grotesque, fixed smile known as a Glasgow smile. It was an act of mutilation that was both savage and terrifyingly deliberate, a killer's brutal signature carved onto his victim. The Los Angeles Police Department, along with a swarm of reporters from the city's notoriously competitive and sensationalist newspapers, descended on the scene. The crime was so shocking, so visually horrific, that it became an instant media sensation. The first challenge for the police was to identify the victim. She was a ghost, with no identification and no obvious clues to her identity. They took her fingerprints and sent them via a new piece of technology, a sound photo machine, which could transmit photographs over telephone lines to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Within hours, they had a match. The fingerprint belonged to a 22-year-old woman named Elizabeth Short. With a name, the police and the press began to piece together the tragic, transient life of the woman who was about to become a legend. Elizabeth Short was born in Massachusetts, one of 5 daughters in a family that was broken apart by the Great Depression. She had a restless spirit and a deep, yearning desire for fame. Like so many young women of her generation, she was drawn to the glamour and promise of Hollywood. She had drifted across the country, from Massachusetts to Florida to California, working as a waitress and living in cheap boarding houses, always on the periphery of the dream she was chasing. She was known for her striking looks, a cascade of dark, raven black hair, pale blue eyes, and a habit of dressing entirely in black, often with a flower pinned in her hair. This penchant for dark clothing would, in the hands of the press, give her the nickname that would make her immortal, the Black Dahlia, a name borrowed from a popular film noir of the time. The Blue Dahlia. The investigation into her final days revealed a life of instability and fleeting connections. She had been staying in a series of cheap hotels and apartments in the Los Angeles and Hollywood area in the weeks leading up to her death. The last time anyone could say with certainty they had seen her alive was on the evening of January 9th, 6 days before her body was found. She had been dropped off by a traveling salesman she had been dating at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She told him she was meeting her sister. After that, she vanished. The 6 days between her last sighting and the discovery of her body became known as the missing week, a black hole in the timeline that investigators would never be able to fully account for. The LAPD launched one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. They interviewed hundreds of men whose names were found in her address books or who were known to have associated with her. They tracked down every taxi driver, every hotel clerk, every person who might have seen her during her missing week. But every lead was a dead end. The killer had been as clean and as precise in his movements as he had been with his knife. He had left behind a horrifying spectacle, a perfectly staged crime scene, but he had taken all the evidence with him. The autopsy revealed further horrifying details. It confirmed that she had been tortured for several days before her death. The cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage and shock, the result of the blows to her head and the mutilation of her face. The bisection of her body was so clean and precise that the coroner concluded it was likely performed by someone with surgical training, a doctor or a medical student. The killer had also performed a hemicorporectomy, a procedure that involves removing the internal organs and draining the body of blood. It was a technique that required a level of skill and anatomical knowledge far beyond that of a typical killer. The police were now hunting a new kind of monster. He was not just a killer. He was a sadist and a surgeon, a man of intelligence and precision who had committed a crime of almost artistic cruelty. He had not just killed Elizabeth Short. He had turned her body into a gruesome work of art, a horrifying public statement. And now he was about to do something even more brazen. He was about to reach out from the shadows and begin a direct, taunting conversation with the police and the press, turning the entire city of Los Angeles into a terrified and captive audience for his macabre theater. The murder of Elizabeth Short was a match thrown on the gasoline-soaked landscape of Los Angeles journalism. The city in 1947 was home to a dozen competing daily newspapers, each one locked in a ruthless, circulation-driven war. The crime, with its beautiful, tragic victim, its gruesome, theatrical staging, and its Hollywood backdrop, was the perfect story. The press descended upon the case with a frenzied, almost ghoulish intensity. They dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a nickname that was both romantic and menacing, and they began to craft a public narrative of her life that was a mixture of fact, fiction, and pure, lurid speculation. They painted her as a mysterious femme fatale, a troubled would-be starlet who had been consumed by the dark side of Hollywood. They published stories, many of them completely fabricated, about her supposed promiscuity, her penchant for teasing men, and her tragic, doomed quest for fame. They turned her from a real person, a young woman with a complex and often difficult life, into a one-dimensional character in a film noir of their own creation. This sensationalized coverage had a profound and damaging effect on the investigation. It created a storm of false tips, crank confessions, and public hysteria that swamped the already overwhelmed resources of the LAPD. The killer, it seemed, was an avid reader. On January 23, 1947, about a week after the body was found, the first direct communication arrived. The editor of the Los Angeles Examiner, one of the city's most prominent newspapers, received a phone call. The man on the other end of the line had a strange, soft voice. He identified himself as the killer of the Black Dahlia. To prove his claim, he told the editor that he was going to mail him some of her belongings. He was, he said, tired of the police fouling up the investigation. It was a direct, arrogant taunt, a challenge to both the press and the police. The next day, a package arrived at the Examiner offices, just as the caller had promised. It was a large manila envelope. Inside was a carefully curated collection of Elizabeth Short's personal effects. There was her birth certificate, her social security card, some photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The most disturbing part of the package, however, was what had been done to it. Every single item had been meticulously cleaned with gasoline, wiping them clean of any potential fingerprints, and the envelope itself had been created with a painstaking, almost paranoid level of care. It was a collage of words and letters cut out from movie advertisements and newspapers, glued onto a single sheet of paper, like a ransom note. One of the messages read, "Here are Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." This package was a bombshell. It was definitive proof that the killer was not just a brute, but an intelligent, cunning, and forensically aware individual. He was toying with the investigation, giving them clues while, simultaneously ensuring those clues were forensically useless. The address book with the name of Mark Hansen on the cover immediately made Hansen a prime suspect. Hansen was a wealthy Danish-American businessman and a local nightclub owner who was known to have associated with Elizabeth Short. She had even stayed at his home for a brief period. He was a powerful figure with a shadowy reputation, and he fit the profile of a man who could be involved in such a dark crime. He was intensely investigated by the police, but no direct evidence ever linked him to the murder, and he was eventually cleared. The killer's promised letter soon arrived. Another bizarre, paste-up creation of cut-out words. It read, "Here it is. Turning in Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun with police. Black Dahlia Avenger." The letter was another calculated piece of psychological warfare. The police and the public waited with bated breath on the morning of January 29th. But, of course, no one turned themselves in. The Black Dahlia Avenger, as he had now named himself, was simply playing a game, reveling in the chaos and fear he had created. This initial communication opened the floodgates. Dozens of people, either mentally unstable individuals seeking attention or cruel pranksters, began to send letters and make phone calls to the police and newspapers, all claiming to be the killer. The investigation was swamped with false confessions, each one having to be meticulously investigated and debunked. This deluge of misinformation made it nearly impossible for the police to separate the real clues from the noise. The killer, if he did send any further communications, was now hidden in a crowd of his own creation. The LAPD, under immense public pressure, redoubled their efforts. The investigation was one of the largest in the city's history. They interviewed over 150 potential suspects. They pursued every lead, no matter how flimsy. The list of suspects was a cross-section of Los Angeles society, from wealthy doctors and Hollywood insiders to drifters and small-time criminals. The theory that the killer had medical knowledge remained a central focus. Police investigated numerous doctors, surgeons, and medical students, anyone who would have had the anatomical knowledge and the steady hand to perform the horrific mutilations. One prominent suspect was a man named Dr. George Hodel, a brilliant and respected physician with a dark, hidden side. He was known for his lavish parties, his connections to the Hollywood avant-garde, and his rumored involvement in a variety of illicit activities. His own son, a homicide detective named Steve Hodel, would, decades later, become convinced of his father's guilt and would write a best-selling book laying out the extensive circumstantial case against him. According to Steve Hodel, his father not only had the surgical skill to commit the crime, but he also fit the psychological profile of a narcissistic sadist. He even claimed to have found photographs of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth Short among his father's belongings. The case against Dr. George Hodel remains one of the most compelling and detailed theories, but it is entirely circumstantial, and he was never charged with the crime. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation grew colder. The killer, after his initial taunting communications, fell silent. The trail of clues had led nowhere. The police had a list of over 60 people who had confessed to the crime, all of whom were dismissed as frauds. The city of Los Angeles, which had been so consumed by the case, began to move on. The newspapers found new, fresh tragedies to fill their front pages. But the ghost of the Black Dahlia, the beautiful young woman who had been so brutally and artistically murdered, refused to fade away. Her case became a part of the city's dark mythology, a permanent, unsolved wound. The mystery was no longer just a police investigation. It was a cultural obsession, a story that would be told and retold for generations, each telling adding a new layer of myth and speculation to the central, unanswered question. Who killed the Black Dahlia? In the years and decades that followed, the Black Dahlia case never truly went cold. It simply transitioned from an active police investigation into an enduring cultural obsession and a cottage industry for private investigators, authors, and armchair detectives. The Los Angeles Police Department officially kept the case open, but with no new leads and no fresh evidence, it became a file that gathered dust, a symbol of the department's most famous and frustrating failure. The mystery, however, refused to die. It became a labyrinth of competing theories, each one built around a different potential suspect, and each one offering a tantalizing but ultimately unprovable solution to the enigma. The list of potential suspects that has been compiled over the years is vast and varied, a testament to the wide net the police initially cast and the wild speculation that has followed. The suspects can be broadly grouped into several categories, each representing a different narrative of the crime. The first and most enduring category focuses on men with medical training. The clinical precision of the bisection and the internal organ removal strongly suggested a killer with anatomical knowledge. This led investigators down a path that implicated numerous doctors, dentists, and medical students in the Los Angeles area. The most prominent of these medical suspects remains Dr. George Hodel. The case against him, largely built by his own son, Steve Hodel, after his death, is a powerful and disturbing web of circumstantial evidence. Steve Hodel, drawing on his experience as an LAPD homicide detective, argued that his father fit the profile perfectly. George Hodel was a brilliant physician with a genius-level IQ, but he was also a man with a dark, sadistic streak, a history of sexual abuse allegations, and a fascination with surrealist art which often depicted dismembered female bodies. Steve Hodel theorized that the Glasgow smile carved on Elizabeth Short's face was a tribute to the surrealist artist Man Ray, with whom his father was acquainted. He also uncovered evidence that his father may have been the one to call the Examiner newspaper, and that the handwriting on one of the taunting notes was a potential match to his father's. Furthermore, secret FBI surveillance files from the 1950s revealed that the LAPD had bugged George Hodel's home and had considered him a prime suspect, but had ultimately dropped the case, possibly due to his powerful connections within the city. The case against Dr. Hodel is incredibly detailed and compelling, but it remains entirely circumstantial, without a confession or a definitive piece of physical evidence. He is just one of many ghosts haunting the periphery of the case. The second major category of suspects focuses on the men who were known to have been in Elizabeth Short's orbit during her final days. This includes Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner whose address book was sent to the press. Hansen was a powerful and shady figure, and it was widely rumored that he was involved in illegal activities. The theory posits that Elizabeth may have learned something that threatened Hansen, and he had her silenced. Another key figure was Robert "Red" Manley, the traveling salesman who was the last person to see her alive. He was intensely investigated and cleared by the police after passing multiple polygraph tests. But he remains a figure of suspicion for many. The sheer number of men Elizabeth had interacted with in her transient life, salesmen, soldiers, Hollywood hopefuls, created a vast pool of potential suspects, each with their own brief, unverifiable connection to the victim. A third, more disturbing, line of inquiry suggests that the killer was not a lone individual, but part of a larger, more corrupt system. This theory points to the possibility of a cover-up by the LAPD itself. In the 1940s, the department was notoriously corrupt, with deep ties to organized crime and the city's political machine. Some have speculated that the killer was a powerful, well-connected individual, perhaps a high-ranking police officer, a politician, or a Hollywood mogul, and that the department deliberately botched the investigation to protect him. This would explain the contaminated crime scene, the missing evidence, and the strange reluctance to pursue certain high-profile suspects. In this version of the story, the mystery is not about a failure to solve the crime, but a deliberate conspiracy to conceal the truth. This theory, while feeding into a popular narrative of institutional corruption, is, like the others, impossible to prove. Over the decades, the case has been plagued by a steady stream of false confessions. The sensational nature of the murder seemed to attract a particular kind of disturbed individual, people who craved the infamy of being the Black Dahlia Avenger. The police investigated over 60 of these confessions, and every single one was found to be fraudulent. These false leads consumed thousands of hours of investigative time and further muddied the already murky waters of the case. One of the most persistent questions is why the killer, after his initial brazen communications with the press, suddenly fell silent. If he was a narcissistic performer who craved the spotlight, why did he stop the show? One theory is that the intense police and media scrutiny simply made it too dangerous for him to continue his game. He had made his point, created his terrifying masterpiece, and then wisely retreated into the shadows. Another possibility is that the killer was not a local at all, but a transient who was simply passing through Los Angeles and was long gone by the time the investigation gained momentum. Or perhaps the killer was arrested and imprisoned for an unrelated crime, or was himself killed, taking the secret of the Black Dahlia murder with him to the grave. The case has also become a powerful cultural touchstone, a defining story of Los Angeles noir. It has been the subject of countless books and films, most notably James Ellroy's masterful 1987 novel, The Black Dahlia, and the subsequent film adaptation by Brian De Palma. These fictionalized accounts have further cemented the case in the public imagination, blending the historical facts with the tropes of hard-boiled detective fiction. The character of Elizabeth Short has been endlessly reinterpreted, becoming a symbol of lost innocence, the dark side of the Hollywood dream, and the ultimate, unknowable victim. The real Elizabeth Short has been almost entirely consumed by the legend of the Black Dahlia. Her own story, the story of a young woman from a small town, a daughter and a sister, a person with her own hopes and flaws, has been buried under decades of speculation, mythologizing, and sensationalism. She has become a ghost, a beautiful, tragic face that stares out from old photographs, her identity forever defined by the horrific manner of her death and the enduring, unsolvable mystery that it created. The question of who killed her has become less important, in some ways, than the story itself, a dark, cautionary tale about the city of dreams and the monsters that can lurk in its brightest lights. The enduring legacy of the Black Dahlia murder is not just that of an unsolved crime, but of a cultural phenomenon that has refused to fade. It is a story that has burrowed deep into the American psyche, a perfect and terrible crystallization of our collective anxieties about fame, violence, and the dark, hidden secrets of our cities. The case represents a unique and pivotal moment in the history of crime and media, a point where a real-life tragedy was transformed, almost in real time, into a piece of enduring, popular mythology. One of the primary reasons for its lasting power is the sheer visual horror of the crime itself. The details are so grotesque, so cinematic, that they seem to belong to the world of fiction. The bisection of the body, the draining of the blood, and most unforgettably, the carved Glasgow smile. These are not the hallmarks of a typical homicide. They are the work of a killer who was also a performer, a sadist who was creating a piece of macabre theater. The killer did not just murder Elizabeth Short. He turned her body into a horrifying symbol, a public spectacle of violence that was designed to shock and terrify. This artistic quality of the crime is what has made it so compelling to so many for so long. The case also serves as a dark time capsule of post-war Los Angeles. It captures the city at a moment of profound transition, a place of dizzying highs and terrifying lows. The story of Elizabeth Short, the aspiring actress from a small town, is the archetypal story of the dark side of the Hollywood dream. It is a cautionary tale that has been told countless times, but never with such brutal finality. Her murder became a symbol of the city's predatory nature, its capacity to lure in the hopeful and the innocent and then consume them. The case is inextricably linked to the geography and the mythology of Los Angeles itself, a permanent stain on the city's glamorous facade. The role of the press in shaping the Black Dahlia legend cannot be overstated. The fiercely competitive newspaper culture of the 1940s fanned the flames of the mystery, creating a public narrative that was often more fiction than fact. They created the Black Dahlia persona, and in doing so, they reduced a complex human being to a simple, tragic archetype. This sensationalism, while selling millions of newspapers, did a profound disservice to the victim and to the investigation. It created a fog of misinformation that has never fully lifted, making it almost impossible, even today, to separate the real Elizabeth Short from the fictional character created by the headlines. For law enforcement, the Black Dahlia case remains one of the most famous cold cases in the world, a symbol of investigative frustration. The initial, chaotic handling of the crime scene and the deluge of false confessions created a foundation of confusion from which the investigation never fully recovered. In the decades since, new technologies like DNA analysis have offered a tantalizing hope for a resolution. However, the physical evidence from the case is old, degraded, and has been handled by countless people over the years, making the prospect of finding a clean, viable DNA sample from the killer incredibly slim. Without a major breakthrough, such as the discovery of a long-lost confession or a new piece of physical evidence, the case is likely to remain forever in the realm of the unsolved. But it is the unsolvable nature of the crime that is, perhaps, the key to its enduring power. The mystery is so perfect, so complete, that it invites endless speculation. It is a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, but no picture on the box. It allows each new generation of investigators, authors, and enthusiasts to construct their own theories, to name their own suspects, and to try and impose their own sense of order on a fundamentally chaotic event. The case is a mirror, reflecting our own desire for answers and our fascination with the darkest corners of the human psyche. The real tragedy, of course, is the life of Elizabeth Short herself. She has become a ghost, her memory held hostage by the horrific manner of her death. She is remembered not for who she was, but for what was done to her. She was a daughter, a sister, and a young woman with her own dreams. However naive they may have been, she was a person who, in the final, terrifying days of her life, endured an unimaginable ordeal. And in the end, her life was stolen, and her identity was overwritten by a legend. The Black Dahlia murder will likely never be solved. The killer, whoever he was, almost certainly took his secret to the grave, his identity forever shielded by the passage of time and the chaos of his own creation. He is a phantom who committed a single, spectacular act of violence and then vanished, leaving behind only a mutilated body, a taunting nickname, and a permanent, jagged scar on the history of Los Angeles. The case remains a testament to the fact that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but are destined to haunt us. A chilling reminder that true evil can exist, can strike with brutal, artistic cruelty, and can, sometimes, get away with it completely. The Black Dahlia case is a singular, iconic murder that has become a cornerstone of American dark history. But some mysteries are not about a single victim, but about an entire community, a group of people who vanished from the pages of history, leaving behind only a single cryptic word carved into a tree